Welcome to a joint hearing on Tuesday, February 24th, 2026 with the House Human Services Committee and the House Education Committee. We are hearing a report of a long-awaited, anticipated report from the Joint Fiscal Office on current pre-K and both public and private funding and sort of how it all fits in with both education funding and childcare funding. And we have folks from JFO here today to walk us through their report, which looking forward to. Thank you, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you for having us. For the record, I'm Emily Byrne, Deputy Fiscal Officer for the Legislative Joint Fiscal Office.
I'm Ted Barnett. I'm a Senior Fiscal Analyst at the Joint Fiscal Office.
And Ted and I, along with an incredible amount of staff at JFO, it seems like basically we looped everybody into working on this report this fall and into the winter. Worked on this pre-K report that you guys asked for in Act 73. So we're going to walk through generally what the report says, walk through the program specifically. I think before we jump into this, we have a PowerPoint that I'll pull up, but this is complicated. There's lots of programs that sort of layer on top of each other and they overlap in certain spaces and not in others, which makes understanding it complicated. Part of the reason why we had several people from the Joint Fiscal Office involved in writing the report was just to get different perspectives, because there are sort of lots of complicated things. And for like, I'm a parent of small children, so I've experienced it from the parent perspective. I used to work at the Agency of Education, so to the extent to remember all those education things. Ted has experience with a parent-child center before he came to JFO, so we had sort of a lot of, of our own experience and knowledge, and spend a lot of time having conversations about like, but what about this situation? So like we had our own challenges trying to figure out stuff, even from the experience, our own experience and research that we had done. So that is all to say it's complicated. We're going to start like very high level. Chairs, if you want to have people ask questions either at the end or the beginning, or game for whatever.
We can do a good high level overview before anybody interrupts with questions. That'd be nice.
So with that, we'll jump right in. I know we've got a fair number of slides, but we will jump right in. So this is to give an overview of the early care and learning system, and also the what we found is definitions are really important in this space. Right. Universal pre-K is different from childcare, which is different from a preschooler, which is different from early care and learning, and which age groups overlap and what entity of state government has jurisdiction over which sort of slice of the pie you're talking about matters. So we sort of titled this early care and learning to give us the sort of biggest, broadest strokes of covering kids. Primarily, we focused on, in this report, PreK 73, the children who are 3, 4, and 5 who are not yet in kindergarten. This is our just JFO or nonpartisan legislative office. We put this in all of our stuff, just a reminder of who we are and what we're doing here. Something I wanted to mention. Oh, and I would also mention too, so we'll talk about this again, but it doesn't hurt to say it multiple times. We're not experts in the outcomes of the current early child care system. So the report that we wrote, the analysis that we've done, what we're going to talk about today is really like the mechanics, how it works, and sort of the academic exercise, if you will, around like how people may behave based on the existing programs that we have and how they overlap with each other. We're not going to talk about are kids better off or sort of what the outcomes are. That's really a conversation to have with folks from the Department for Children and Families, the Agency of Education, and other folks who work in that space. So just wanted to put that out there that we're not the experts on, outcomes or is this working or not. This is purely like what policies have we put in place and how do they function. So initially we'll go over the early care and learning programs that we talk about specifically here in the report. We'll go through the report itself, specifically charged Joint Fiscal Office to look at incentives. So how people react to the policies that exist and the financial incentives that are out there in the current system. And we broke that into 3 major groups: parents and families, public schools, and private providers. And then we'll talk about the options that we outlined in the report. And these are just 3 options that JFO kind of came up with, and some takeaways for you to think about next steps as you do your work. So the language, this is the specific language that's in Act 73, the intent around pre-K. The open question, I think, around pre-kindergarten in the space of education transformation is what should the weight be in the education funding formula for pre-kindergarten? And as a starting point to talk about that, this is the language for the report. And just highlighting the specific piece that we're reviewing the financial incentives that exist in the early care and learning system. Well, we'll say this again multiple times, but I'll just call it out right now. We did not get into the other incentives that exist in the world that are not financial that would drive an entity to do other things, right? There are community incentives, or there are lots of other reasons why a private child care center or a school district or parents will make a decision about how to interact with the system. But we are just talking about financial in this report and in this presentation.
And as the money people, that makes sense.
Yes, definitely. So we'll start with high-level overview of the existing early care and learning programs in Vermont. And before we jump into that, actually, this is listed two maps that we found in our research. This is put out by the National Institute for Early Education Research. One of the things that I think makes Vermont's early care and learning system unique is the service to 3-year-olds. So you notice on the left-hand side is a map that shows the pre-K programs available that are publicly funded in all the states. Green meaning there's access. It's hard to read because it's small, but access to 60 to over 70% of children in that age cohort. And then on the right is the 3-year-old map, and Vermont is the only green state in this. So we've got about over 75% of 4-year-olds are enrolled in a universal pre-K program, and over 50, up to 58% of 3-year-olds are enrolled in universal pre-K. And this was as of 2024. So those numbers are maybe different now, but that's the most recent one. So the early care and learning system that we have in Vermont, we focused on three programs that support youngest Vermonters and their families. The Head Start program, which is a federal program, the Child Care Financial Assistance program, and the Universal Pre-Kindergarten program. We did not, I should also couch, we did not get into specifically special education services for this age group, children's integrated services. Are there other ones? I'm sure there's other ones that I'm forgetting, but these are the three that we focused on in terms of early care and learning for this age group. And so these three programs are highly interconnected, and changes to one of them are going to impact the other systems. It's very much like a child services ecosystem, if you will. So the Head Start program is a federal program. It's a comprehensive early childhood development program designed to promote school readiness for children in low-income families. It serves 0 to 5, as well as pregnant women and their families. And it's really meant to serve not just the kids, but sort of more holistic with the family. It's not just childcare. The Head Start programs require that states provide, that the programs themselves provide a non-federal match to draw down federal funds for those programs. In a lot of instances, we found the Head Start programs in Vermont are utilizing other existing state programs that Vermont has, including the Children's Financial Assistance Program and Universal Pre-K as their non-federal match. So then we have the Child Care Assistance Program. So it's a state program that helps families afford childcare through subsidy payments based on a family's income and the number of children in the family. It's not just for early education providers. I think that's an important thing to point out. It's 3, 4, and 5-year-olds get this, but it's a 0 to 13 and up to 17 if a child has disabilities. So it helps parents pay for after-school care, summer care, and infant and toddler care, in addition to the preschool age. And it utilizes both a mix of state and federal funding. So most of the funding currently for the Child Care Financial Assistance Program comes from the Child Care Contribution Special Fund, which is funded through the payroll tax that was passed by the General Assembly in 2023, along with some federal funds. There's some global commitment funds for children that qualify. And then there's general fund that supports the CCFAP program. So this is just a quick example of eligibility for CCFAP for an example family that's family of 4. This is the income table as of last March of 2025. So families up to 575% of federal poverty can qualify for a state subsidy. As of March, a family of 4 at 575% of the federal poverty level would have had an annual income of about $185,000 a year. The federal poverty level itself is tied to the size of your family. So there are tables for each family size going from 3 to 6, and then anyone over 6. And so if a family was at the 575% of federal poverty, and they were, this table shows based on what your level of federal poverty, where your income lies in the federal poverty scale, how much your weekly share or your weekly out-of-pocket cost is for the child care financial assistance program. So if there was a family that was sort of at the top of this income scale at 575% of federal poverty, they would be required to pay $425 per week for childcare, or about $22,000 a year out of pocket.
Emily?
Yep.
I think this is my understanding that, in particular for families at that higher income or middle income level, or for anybody actually, who has a copay, that copay is on the first child, but any child after that is free of charge.
Correct. Yes.
I'm not sure that everybody would know that.
Yes. And that was a change that happened in Act 76.
Yes.
That the out-of-pocket cost it doesn't matter how many kids you have. It's sort of capped at that amount based on your income. So, and then the third program that we talked about is the Universal Pre-Kindergarten Program. So this requires that all school districts provide access to publicly funded pre-kindergarten education to families that can secure a slot in a pre-qualified program. So, and that's an important thing to call out specifically. So either the parent has to enroll at their public school if the public school provides a program, or the parent can choose to enroll at a different pre-qualified provider that is qualified to provide universal pre-K. If the parent can't find a space, then there's no universal pre-K funding for that family. So universal pre-K in Vermont is a minimum of 10 hours per week for 35 weeks a year. And it's for 3, 4, and 5-year-olds not yet enrolled in kindergarten. And so the universal pre-K program can be provided by a qualified public or private program. So it can be in public schools or at a child care center or at a family-based family child care home. What's the mission?
Family child care.
Family child care home. Thank you. As long as they're qualified. And so if a district itself does not offer a pre-K program, or if the parent chooses to enroll in a different qualified program, either at a public school that's not their district or at a private provider, the district must pay the statewide universal pre-K tuition rate to that selected program. That payment that is paid, the tuition payment, is part of the district's education spending. And if the district itself operates a public program in-house, then those costs are part of the district's education spending itself.
And there isn't, when we were taking testimony on Act 76, we saw wide discrepancies in number of hours of UPK available to families, and in some public school districts, they were providing whatever you want to call full day, full week, and then others, none. And so I just want to be sure that my understanding be accurate, that, so let's just say a school district is providing more than the 10 hours a week, they include that in their education spending, and that's all part of the calculation of the cost of education, right?
Yes.
It's not, okay. There's no like cap on the costs for 10 hours a week. It can be for whatever the school district is providing.
Yes. Yeah, that's correct. I think, and we'll probably say this more than once in this, but what we found was that if you know about one public schools pre-K program, you know about one public schools pre-K program. There are yeah, it's different in every district in terms of how, what's provided and how much it costs. So that's universal pre-K. So, and it's important to point out that like Head Start, we talked about, uses both universal pre-K and CCFAP as their local match in many instances. And this is true of other programs as well. So qualified programs that operate a universal pre-K program can receive universal pre-K funds from school districts, as well as childcare financial assistance program to support the remaining costs of care. And school districts that operate full-day programs, we found that in some instances may actually receive childcare financial assistance funds to help offset the additional costs of the program. So they have their universal pre-K spending to cover 10 hours of whatever they provide. But then if the public school chooses to offer more, some public schools, not all, it was some of the business managers we talked to, have become licensed by CDD for the remaining part of their program, and then are drawing down CCFAP funds in order to help reduce their education spending. And again, it's not this, it's different in every district, how they're doing that or whether or not they are at all. So, and then just for a high level perspective, how many kids we're talking about. So we looked, and for those who are in education, and I'm sure in human services, like data collection and counting is not always, we're not always counting the same groups the same ways. So just to disclaim that, but just as a high level overview. So if we look at the census in Vermont from 2024, there are about 11,000 3- and 4-year-old kids in Vermont. Right, the census doesn't tell us anything about the 5-year-olds that aren't yet enrolled in kindergarten, so we can't include them in that number. And then the average daily membership in fiscal year 2025 for the Agency of Education for the 3-, 4-, and 5-year-olds not yet enrolled in kindergarten was about 7,500 kids. CCFAP enrollment for that same age group, so the 3-, 4-, and 5-year-olds, was 4,700 kids. I talked about definitions earlier, but when we talk about preschool age kids, that's kids that are 36 months or older until they matriculate into kindergarten. And Head Start enrollment was 1,200, almost 1,250 in 2024 for the Office of Head Start. And I should, clarify that, like, they're not distinct, right? They're only 11,000 3- and 4-year-olds. Some of them, 7,000 are enrolled in UPK. Some of them are also enrolled in CCFAP, and some of them may also be enrolled in Head Start.
It's not unduplicated. The 11,013 is unduplicated, but the rest of it below is not.
Correct. So this again is just the language from the report, just a reminder. So we're going to start talking about the report itself and the incentives that we discuss in the report and some of the things that we found related to financial incentives. This is a funny, when you have financial people put together graphics, this is what you get.
I have a quick question over here.
Before we move on to that section, if I get back on slide 13, the second bullet point about school districts operating a full-day program and CCFAP. Any additional insights you can share on how that works? Because they're building a school budget long before they know the student population and who's receiving what level of CCFAP. How might that work?
Yeah, I think like when you build any budget, right? Like you have to make some assumptions about the demographics of the population that you've got and who may be coming in. I think school districts have to make assumptions if they're going to operate a pre-K program that they're actually going to fill all of the seats in that pre-K program, unlike with any grade, right? So that's I think a challenge in budgeting generally, and then have to make assumptions about whether or not. And I think there are some school districts that receive CCFAP to help offset costs, and depending on how they operate, I believe there are some that will also ask for parental contributions if they're not eligible for CCFAP. And there
I think
is,
that's one of the requirements, actually, if you're going to utilize CCFAP, you have to invoice all parents. Just to add to that question, just went on my head. Well, school districts do child finding. You see these things on Front Porch Forum and stuff, or in the paper, asking people to, at that certain age to check in with your school district. So they have some sense, but.
And the other thing I might add to the piece is a lot of school districts are also contracting with childcare providers to provide services in their schools. And I would say the number of school districts that are receiving CCFAP are relatively small compared to the ones who are probably contracting with private providers.
You're talking about contracting, did you say within their own school, not the private providers across the community?
With an outside private provider.
Within their building.
Within the building,
Yeah, within the
utilizing
building.
public building space.
Doug, I'm going to get some clarification on this from Ledge Council, because it was always my understanding that within the school day, which of course we haven't defined what the school day is, that you can't charge if you're a public school for services. So maybe after the 10 hours of pre-K, something kicks in and what you're really providing is childcare.
It's childcare, right, yeah.
And I think in the folks that we've talked to, there's like like the first 2 hours of the day are a UPK program, and then the remainder are a childcare program, right? It's similar to after school, right? School ends at this time, and then the services provided are after school services. Okay, let's see where we were. Oh yeah, my funny graphic that when you get the money people to make this, but this is the like, right, we've got schools, providers and parents, and then a bunch of adorable 4-year-olds with balloons. Anyway, so before we jump into the incentives, just want to like put some things on the table in terms of what the discussion that we're about to have is and what it isn't, right? So the incentives we're going to talk about aren't exhaustive, right? They're the ones that we flagged and identified. And there's probably things that we didn't think about. Even though half of JFO was involved in thinking about this over the summer, we probably missed some things. And the incentive that we talk about may cause people to do something, but right, it's probably not the only thing that people are thinking about when they're trying to decide how they're going to interact with the system. And there's no way to know if the incentives that we talk about are what's actually driving people to do things, right? From an academic perspective, we can assume that like if A plus B, then people will do C. But at the end of the day, people may not do that. And we have no way of knowing if that's how people actually behave. So it's sort of the hypothetical level. And, there are a lot of Vermonters, we, just looked at the number of kids that are enrolled. There are a lot of kids enrolled and are utilizing these programs. And it's important for you all to really understand the outcomes of those systems. Again, I mentioned this before, but we're not the experts on the outcomes. And sort of how people have been impacted by the changes in CCFAP, right? Those have only really been in existence for slightly over a year, the new increased reimbursement rates and the changes in how things are calculated. So there's still a lot there, or to look at, what the educational outcomes are for kids who have been through a UPK program and who hasn't. So yeah, additionally, like these are both general incentives and sort of academic. Act 73 told us to talk about the financial incentives in early care and learning. Other incentives that aren't financial, and we'll keep saying this throughout. And just to note, we didn't look at the special education population specifically. There's other things to think about when thinking about the EEE program and kids with special education, or children who are identified as needing special education services who are 3, 4, 5, not enrolled in kindergarten. So in families and early care and learning providers, they're working together, I think is important to point out. And not just, right, it's not just childcare providers, it's not just school districts, everybody sort of in the community is trying to figure out what works and figuring out how to set the cost of care that works for people. And I think generally schools and private providers want to meet the needs of their community and families. And so a lot of what we talk about is theoretical, right? It's things that happen at the margins of policymaking. And that's not unique to the early care and learning system. This happens in a lot of public policy places, right? Where there are, we talk about the benefits cliff, right? Like people are going to behave differently if they approach that margin and, oh, should I enroll in that program if it's going to impact me this way or that? But there are a lot of families who are interacting with these systems without approaching those areas of having to make these decisions. So, the just wanted to, name that these probably aren't happening to a lot of people, but they probably exist given the system that we have. So yeah, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ted and let him talk about financial incentives for parents and families. You can try. So
Fantastic. It's that, okay. I'm not, for full transparency, if I keep talking and things don't move, I don't often do animation. So this is a whole new venture for me. Okay, when families are determining how to interact with the system, as we've been talking about with incentives, right? Folks are thinking about all sorts of factors. These can include things like supporting their children's healthy development and learning. My brother just became a parent ×2, and he's really trying to figure out these types of things for his family, right? Folks are also thinking through how their income and the number of children in their family are impacting what they're eligible for within the CCFAP program. They're also comparing that to the tuition of their local childcare providers and whether that childcare provider is actually feasible for them to get to work in the morning. Yes, the number of kids that are in the family, the number of hours for care. So we'll spend some time talking about CCFAP certificates, right? And whether they're part-time versus full-time versus extended care, and how that creates some interesting incentives for folks. The need that the family has for specific types of services and whether a provider offers those types of services or would be a great fit for their child. And then ultimately personal preferences. Folks, when they're looking at providers, some are looking for a more nature-based where kids are, looking at bugs and trees and whatnot. And some folks are, looking for a different environment. So yes, it comes down to how that provider matches the family's needs. The incentives. So this is where we're going to outline one of the places where we start to see something that resembles incentives at the margin. So the incentive to enroll in CCFAP depends ultimately on what the estimated weekly family share is for the family under CCFAP compared to the market rate tuition for a provider. So for example, in this first bullet, if that CCFAP family share is $375 per week, and they're looking at centers that are charging less than $375 per week, it's not worth it for them in that context to enroll in CCFAP. They would have to fill out more paperwork, and if the center's not willing to meet them where they are, they would have to theoretically spend more money out of pocket. Though we will note that in part of this matching and how providers are working with families, providers don't have to collect that full family share. And so they have an incentive on the other end to put together a financial package for families, maybe decrease the amount they would collect to the family share to match the market tuition. The family says, great, I'll enroll in CCFAP, and it kind of helps everyone out. Hours are another consideration, as I hinted at earlier. I mentioned that there are 3 different certificates that a family can earn depending on their service needs. And so the part-time certificate is for 1 to 25 hours of care. Full-time is 25 to 50 hours, and then extended care is for 50 plus. And so the amount of CCFAP subsidy a family receives is dependent on the number of hours they're eligible for. So yes, when a family goes to just CDD and they outline their service need, and CDD will say, yes, you are eligible for a part-time certificate, and that gets them less money than if they were eligible for a full-time certificate. And this is where an extra complication for the universal pre-K program comes in. The amount of hours that are in the UPK program, so our 10 hours per week, that reduces the number of hours the family needs for purposes of CCFAP eligibility. I think, yes, we go into it on the next slide. So if the family, let's say they qualify for 34 hours, they qualify for 30 hours. If they're enrolled in UPK as well, that reduces by 10 hours, and it would change the type of certificate that they're getting. The subsidy for the family is reduced. So great, it says this in words.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So does CDD take into consideration the varying hours of pre-K, or do they just make a standard 10-hour deduction? So in some school districts that are providing pre-K for, I'll just use the term, full day, full week, and the family applies for CCFAP, are they just deducting 10 hours or are they deducting 35 hours?
I am going to speak, so yes, this is primarily a consideration within the private system. My sense would be, and I can check in with CDD to confirm, but it would be the 10 hours of UPK, because that's considered the 10-hour, the UPK program is for 10 hours a week. And if the private or the public school was offering more than that, that's considered childcare, and that gets into a different bin of hours. But yes, broadly speaking, CDD is considering UPK to be 10 hours per week and reducing that off the family certificate.
So they only calculate the 10 hours a week, even if a school district is providing more than 10 hours.
Because my understanding is that those additional hours would be considered childcare. It's not part of it.
They're not. They're not all that.
So, and I think, without knowing what every public school is doing, right?
Right, they're all different, as you
They're all
said.
different.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of a scenario where a public school would provide more than 10 hours of pre-K and also work to get childcare financial assistance.
I'm not saying that they do. I'm just trying to figure out for individual families. So if a family was requesting extended care, so the 50 hours, and they got 30 or 35 hours of pre-K, then if the school's only deducting, I mean, if CDD is only deducting 10 hours, and I'm just going to use Winooski as an example because that's the one that I'm most familiar with. They have quote unquote full-time pre-K. That's not a joint funding with CCFAP, is my understanding. I'm understanding it to be all education fund. So it wouldn't make sense to me that CDD would only deduct 10 hours. If a family was needing 50, that they would deduct 30 hours or 35.
I think, do you want to go? Yeah.
I can give it a shot, and then yeah, in that case, since the child care financial assistance program isn't involved in Winooski's program, CDD wouldn't be part of that hours calculation.
Well, and I think when the parent goes to say, you know, I'm applying for 50 hours, I'm getting 35 hours from my public school, then I think CDD would say, okay, so you need an additional 15.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to.
That's a part-time certificate.
Under 10 hours that they deduct, or if
I think it's
based upon what's at that local school district.
They're looking at what the circumstances of that family are and how many hours are needed from that family. So if you're getting care from somewhere else, which it could be, you know, you have one parent that's staying at home, right? And that parent can cover, you know, CDD is going to take that into consideration when they're determining what certificate that family qualifies for. So I think it would work the same way where they're looking sort of at the full scope of care that child they're applying for and that the child is receiving, and then determining how many hours CCFAP would fund accordingly. Yeah. And I think, yeah, to just drive this home, Ted's point home, right? So the incentive that plays out here, right, is that if the family enrolls in UPK and then CDD says, okay, well, you're getting 10 hours from here, and they reduce the number of hours that you need and it drops you into the part-time bucket, that changes you're out of, you know, how much CDD will pay your childcare provider. And that can, you know, it may be worth the family not enrolling in universal pre-K so that they maintain a full-time certificate, right? It's really at that margins. It's really depending on how many hours they determine that family qualifies for, but it can impact, you know, how much money you get from childcare financial assistance if you're enrolled in universal pre-K and how they interact with each other. Yeah, that's what the last is.
And so as a recap of the financial incentives for families, families are considering a lot when they are interacting with the system. For folks who earn up to 575% of the federal poverty line, they can qualify for the state CCFAP subsidy. families are looking at their out-of-pocket costs and how those compare to the CCFAP family share, they would be charged based on income if the childcare provider wouldn't work with them. And the CCFAP benefit that folks receive is based on the number of hours of service need the family has. And that CDD accounts for UPK in those calculations.
So next, we're going to talk about school districts and financial incentives for UPK. So as we talked about earlier, school districts are required to offer the universal pre-K program to parents that can secure a slot at the pre-qualified program. Can be provided in-house by the district or by paying the UPK tuition to a private provider or a pre-qualified, I should say, a pre-qualified program elsewhere. So it can be a private provider or it can be a school district that's not the child's home school district. And parents ultimately get to decide where their children are going to receive their universal pre-K. Under Act 73, there are going to be different financial incentives around the providing universal pre-K for school districts. It may be that under the way that Act 73 is currently constructed, some districts may be incentivized to only provide tuition for universal pre-K versus other districts may have incentives to operate programs locally and receive students from surrounding districts. So from this fiscal standpoint, different districts have different incentives around how to do this. So who currently pays for universal pre-K? Ultimately, the cost of universal pre-K is borne by the education fund through district budgets. So if a child's enrolled in a universal pre-K program in a public school, the cost to operate the program is part of the district's budget. If the child's enrolled at a UPK program at another provider, either another public school or a private provider, the child's home district sends a fixed amount to cover the 10 hours for 35 weeks of the year to the provider where that parent has put that the child is enrolled at. So in 2025, 2026, that tuition rate was almost $4,000. And yeah, that's part of the education spending. So just a real quick, because we only have half of y'all are on the education committee and the other half aren't, just to make sure that these terms are in here in case you need to refer back to them and just to remind people what they are. So long-term weighted average daily membership is the district's 2-year average student membership after applying all the student weights. Under the current system, the long-term weighted average daily membership is used to determine tax capacity. It does not translate to an actual payment to anybody. It's just to drive tax capacity. The difference in Act 73 is that long-term weighted average daily membership is going to determine the district's education opportunity payment. So there will be a direct exchange of dollars and not the taxing capacity calculation. So in tax capacity weights, we'll talk about this a little bit, but so under current law and including pre-K, again, just keep saying this, it doesn't correspond to an actual funding amount. It drives the calculation of tax rates and then can increase or decrease the taxing capacity of a district accordingly. And essentially when all else is held equal, an increase in a district's taxing capacity will lower its homestead property tax rate. So just to put those things out there, they play into sort of how the weights play in. So under current law and in the current iteration of Act 73, the pre-K weight is negative 0.54. So for each student enrolled in a district utilizing universal pre-K, regardless of where they attend. So if they are in a public program or if their funds are traveling to the pre-qualified provider where they're receiving universal pre-K, the district receives an additional 0.46 in their long-term weighted average daily membership count. We should also note that a universal pre-K student can receive other weights. So they can receive economic disadvantage weights and they can receive the English language learner weights. I'll note one thing that we found in talking with school districts is it doesn't sound, not all school districts are necessarily collecting this information for all of the students in pre-K. So if they're tuitioned out or even if they're internal, they're not necessarily collecting all this information for these kids. So and I think that the negative weight, right, reflects that it's only a 10-hour program. It's not the full day pre-K. So Currently, the financial impact of universal pre-K varies by district. Districts have to make different decisions on how they're going to provide universal pre-K and how that impacts overall education spending. I've said this like 6 times, so I'm going to say it again. So under the current system, right, it's driving their taxing capacity. It does not directly correspond to funding amounts. I think in conversations that we've had, there was a tendency to take, oh, well, if average per pupil spending is this, you multiply it by the weight, and that's how much money the school district gets. Those in the education side of things know that that's not how it works, right? Like it drives their taxing capacity, which changes per pupil spending for that individual district. And
So
so
it's the amount of tuition payment that's paid, you know, if they're not getting it from that school district directly, is that just considered an education expense?
So in like, based on what's going on locally and local education spending and how much it would cost to operate a program internally versus outside of the school, right? Those financial incentives are going to vary in every school district. This is different compared to Act 73, where it is going to correspond to an actual educational opportunity payment. And the weights do have a direct relationship to funding. So if Act 73 goes into effect as outlined, the district's long-term weighted average daily membership will be used to determine the educational opportunity payment. And as currently written, it's at that negative 0.54. So the count of those pre-K students would correspond to a proration of the educational opportunity payment accordingly. So that in FY 2025 dollars translates to about $7,000 per pre-K student if the weights stay as they are. In fiscal year 25, the pre-K tuition rate was $3,800. I should just call this, if you go earlier in the slide, the tuition rate was slightly higher. The reason why there's 2 different numbers is because Act 73 was based all on FY 2025 numbers and assumptions. The pre-K tuition earlier is the current year spending. So we wanted to make sure like that is by statute inflated by the NEPA index, the sort of the inflator that's typically used in the education space, that's inflated. But if we're going to compare apples to apples in Act 73, we got to use the FY 25 numbers. So based on fiscal 25, the universal pre-K tuition was the $3,884 amount. And so assuming no changes, that in effect would leave about $3,000 in funding the difference between what the school district will get paid and what the UPK tuition rate is. And then any additional weights that student would receive would be on top of that. We don't have it specifically noted here, but I think it's important to talk about that the universal pre-K program does not come with 0 administrative expense for school districts or for private providers. Frankly, to the extent the school districts have to manage wherever any of the parents have decided to send their kids and whatever the local program costs. And that's not without, I think school districts have had to hire staff to cover the implementation of UPK. So there's some part of that payment to the school districts, or the amount that school districts receive for universal pre-K, covers both the tuition costs, but then also just the administration of the program itself.
Can I just clarify that right now, under Act 73, we do not have an assigned, well, I guess we have it set, the idea is that we will create a new rate depending on what policies we implement for universal pre-kindergarten. Yeah.
Go ahead, Doug.
And so that 6,915 is whether the school district is providing service in the school or they're paying a provider.
Correct.
And what they pay to the provider, private provider, is the 3,884.
Correct. And blind to, at least as it currently is laid out in current law, blind to whether or not the school district provides only 10 hours in-house, or if it provides a full day, 35-hour a week program. It is treats everybody the same currently. So I just talked about this, but so with those remaining UPK funds, assuming no other changes are made, right? If it stays as is, the district will have different incentives on what it's going to offer. So a district could be incentivized to only tuition its universal pre-K kids. They would, send the tuition payment to the private providers or to the other school districts, and then the remaining educational opportunity payment could be used to administer the program and then for whatever else. And the opposite may be true. Some districts may have incentives to offer in-house programs, especially if they can receive pupils from other school districts. That revenue would be offsetting revenue in terms of calculating education spending and costs for the school district.
And it's my understanding that the way the UPK law is written right now, there's no requirement, nobody's responsible for actually assuring that there is UPK available in every school district, whether it be public or private.
Correct. There is why we sort of keep including if the parents can find a slot.
Right.
That's the important thing, that there is no guarantee that anybody gets universal pre-K. It is,
Right.
if you can.
That's why I hate calling it universal, because it's not universal.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, there's no requirement that if I show up and want my kid to go to whatever program that they get a spot. So it's important to also mention that aside from the funding piece, there's lots of other decisions that go into the school district's calculus to offer in terms of a program, right? Both actual capacity in the building, ability to hire teachers, and all of the other logistics associated with offering pre-K, right? How does it work in your budget is one thing, but there's also other, community needs and other pieces. And yeah, whether or not you actually have the space to offer a program is probably one of the major drivers, and whether or not a school district actually has programs for pre-K. So, as I mentioned, so there's lots of non-financial incentives for school districts when they're thinking about providing universal pre-K. They may be in an area that doesn't have private providers, and the school district wants to provide this service for its community, and the local voters have decided that this is an important thing for the public school to provide. There may be a need for additional services within the community. So school districts generally have the staff available to provide special education services, for example. So it may make sense to offer an in-house universal pre-K program to ensure that children who need additional services can receive those services. And again, I mentioned this before, but they may not offer it because they don't have the space to do it. It depends on each district. And you all know every district and community is different. And the decisions about how they're going to offer, pre-K, we have seen is different across the state. So yeah, and they have to think about what works best in their communities, right? Can other providers meet the needs of the community so that parents can go to work and so that kids are getting what they need and are ready for kindergarten? But in that, they've got to think about, how that interacts with pupil counts, the cost of running the program, and what that does to their tax rates and education spending, and whether or not they can use it as a revenue generating mechanism, either by, becoming qualified for childcare financial assistance, being able to provide the program and bringing in other revenue, or getting kids from other districts to attend their program. We're working with private providers. I think Ted mentioned that earlier. We found there are instances where there are nonprofits operating after UPK programs in school districts. There are financial relationships there. So, and as I said, 47 times now, but there are different programs in each. And this is just a couple examples that we pulled up, right? So St. Johnsbury, for example, offers a public pre-K program that's all day for 4-year-olds. Parents can send their 4-year-olds to that program, or they can opt to go anywhere else. That parent choice hasn't changed. But they have a full day program for 4-year-olds, but not for 3-year-olds. So 3-year-olds can go to receive tuition to go to other places. Only 4-year-olds can go to pre-K at the public school. Rutland City doesn't operate a program, and all 3- and 4-year-olds in the Rutland City School District go to other providers that aren't the school district. Versus Bennington and Rutland, they have different operate different things in different schools throughout and different districts within the supervisory union. And one of the things that makes this challenging and why doing a lot of deep analysis on this is that we don't currently have statewide data on the pre-K programs that are offered by school districts. So other than, reaching out to every single one of them and gathering that data, which I believe the grant that Building Bright Futures just received, this may be on their list of to-dos, but as of right now, we don't have statewide data on what pre-K programs are offered in individual public schools. So with that, Ted will talk about incentives for private providers.
So AOE is not able to provide they don't collect data on pre-K.
They collect a lot of data on pre-K. They don't collect information on the specific programs at individual schools and school districts.
What's that mean?
Meaning they know, they have a lot of information about kids enrolled in universal pre-kindergarten and the long-term weighted ADM stuff.
So they know the number of kids, just not where they're receiving service?
Or for how many hours a week.
For how many hours, yeah.
Because I think we've seen from Building Bright Futures information about the breakout between public and private.
But they can't tell, we did not get the data, or data doesn't exist to say Montpelier Roxbury has however many kids in universal pre-K, how many of them are tuitioned and how many of them are in. There's no statewide information on that. And then how many hours are each of those kids receiving?
Okay. Interesting.
You're doing private providers.
I am. So the main piece that private providers are thinking about is how, and not to be super straightforward about it and think about it in revenue, that different ages of kids generate different amounts of revenue in each classroom. So they're also thinking about UPK payments and how family demographics impact whether the UPK payment goes to them or whether it reduces the family's weekly family share. And then they're also thinking about how much that UPK payment compares to the overall cost of running the universal pre-kindergarten program, because it requires certain teacher criteria, you're doing surveys, you're doing family engagement events. So yeah, those are the three we're going to talk about in this section. If you want to reflect, as we've reflected nearly everywhere else, that these do not reflect the full set of incentives faced by providers. But yeah, we will go into different revenue per classroom. So at licensed centers, different ages have different staffing requirements. So within infant classrooms, the staffing ratio is 1 teacher to every 4 students. And the maximum classroom size is 8. For toddlers, that is 1 to 5 for maximum classroom size of 10. And then for preschoolers, it's 1 to 10 for a maximum classroom size of 20. So if you're just looking at gross revenue at the full-time CCFAP rate for those children, you'll see that even though the infant weekly rate is higher than it is for preschool, it doesn't compensate for the fact that you can have more children in a preschool classroom than you can in an infant classroom. And the difference is pretty substantial, right? If you just take the number, we're talking gross revenue here, 20 kids who are earning $349 per week. The total revenue for that classroom is over $450,000. But on the infant side, when you have 8 children in that class and they're receiving a CCFAP rate of $471, that translates to a little more than $170,000. So this is absolutely something centers are thinking about and trying to figure out how they can meet the needs of their community and the kids that are in that community, but also making their business model viable.
And are these ratios in the DCF rules? Because in Act 73, that number 20 is less than that.
I will have to, yeah, that's my understanding, but I may have, I'll check into it.
I'm just, if we're thinking about how it impacts overall, I don't remember what the exact number was, but I remember the littler kids didn't they have a different
I
number?
thought we eliminated everything in class size minimums
So
in
you're-
grade one.
Under kindergarten, eliminated
There used to be in
everything.
the draft, but I thought that changed. in the
Okay.
ordinance.
Yeah. And they were minimums, not maximums.
Minimums, right.
Thank you. Yeah, and here's the point, right, that although you're receiving different weekly reimbursement rates through CCFAP for different ages of students, they don't compensate for the fact that you have more students in differently aged classrooms. So when you add the expense side, this is from the 2025 cost modeling report that was done by First Children's Finance. This is contracted by DCF. And it shows that at licensed centers, at a small center, and in centers probably, right, for infants, when you use their cost model to calculate the full set of expenses associated with those classrooms and compare it with the CCFAP subsidy, that amount is negative. We'll note that it doesn't necessarily mean at every center they're taking a loss on infant students. This is just saying when you plug these factors into the cost model used by DCF, this is the output you get. For toddlers, centers under this cost model are roughly breaking even, but for preschool students, right, there's potentially some additional revenue that can be given to those students. And so when building their business model, centers are thinking about the classrooms they have and how they can support different classrooms. And I will note that the difference between what's happening at licensed centers versus family childcare homes is because different ages of students can be served by the same staff in family care homes, so their business model looks different. The second piece is talking about how UPK payments benefit a program differently depending on family demographics. I'm going to animate, whoops. I'm not used to animation. Went a little too fast. So and so a whole bunch of ifs here. There's some assumptions in this model, right? Because as we're talking about the CCFAP certificates, you could have different CCFAP certificates. There can be different number of kids in a family. So we've taken, we're looking at this picture for a family that has a CCFAP certificate for full-time care. There's one child in the family. And so in this example, if 100% of the family's care is provided through CCFAP, so they have a family share of $0, the center is receiving the state rate, so the $439 per week. And they're also receiving for the 35 weeks, there is universal PreK. They're also receiving the UPK payment. However, if you're looking at a family that has a family share of over $125, the center or the provider is only receiving the state rate, but those family costs are reduced. So the UPK payment is getting applied to the family share in that case. And so these tables walk through the math of those calculations. On the left hand, it's a table that's showing the family share of $0, right? The 439. You're adding, this was done for the most recent statewide rate. So converting the statewide rate to a weekly payment for 35 weeks is about $114. And so $114 plus 439 is $553 per child per week for the 35 weeks that you have universal PreK payments. But if in the second example that we're presenting, if the family has, let's say, a family share of $300, that $114 reduces the family's $300 family share by $114. So the family is only paying $186 for the 35 weeks of UPK. And so they're receiving in total $114 from UPK, $186 from the family, and then $139 for the difference between the family's family share and and the statewide rate. And I must also, final caveat is that this is happening in a provider that blends their UPK hours. If they were to separate and call them out, they could calculate their tuition differently, but we're not going to go into those weeds. We're going to keep two examples and keep it straightforward.
I want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. On the left side of what you're saying here, a program with a blended program, they're collecting both CCFAP and UPK, even though the two probably operate seamlessly within the school day.
And this is a case, this is also saying that the amount of hours that the program operates still qualifies them for a full-time certificate. So it's above, they're operating 40 hours per week, you're subtracting the 10 hours of UPK, that leaves 30 hours. And so that still counts as a full-time CCFAP certificate. But yes.
Yeah. And right, just to reiterate, in this instance, right, the only time that this would happen is if a family share is $0. So they're lower income families. As the family share increases, the center will reduce the family payment if they receive UPK.
In the final piece is, this isn't necessarily, doesn't speak to a flaw in the system. I know Janet has testified to, and there might be reasons where a center receives more money to serve families who are at lower income scales. And so this may be this is not necessarily a flaw in the system. Fine. The second piece is, or third piece at this point is, so talking through for a center, you're, in order to become a pre-qualified UPK program, you have to hire a teacher who has a early childhood education or early childhood special education endorsement from AOE. You have to conduct periodic surveys of student progress on their kindergarten readiness. You have to hold family engagement events. And so, yeah, there are a whole host of things you have to do. It's in addition to being a childcare provider in order to do universal pre-K. The first bullet there of hiring a teacher with qualifications from AOE, it is a challenge. It is a challenge, I've heard, for both private providers and in public schools. Finding enough staff to do UPK is certainly a challenge in the system. There are a lot of provisionally licensed folks. So there are many private providers and maybe even public schools who just simply aren't able to do UPK because of that constraint. There are also, this bullet really speaks to me from my past life. There's additional staff capacity to manage surveys, billing, coordinating with school districts or supervisory unions, invoicing, et cetera. So any sort of provider has to have that capacity in order to want to do a UPK program. And so for centers, if they're not seeing, right, they may not, either the relative value of the payment is incentivizing to participate, or yeah, they just simply decide it's not worth the additional costs, or they aren't able to do them.
Are there any numbers that show that this many centers drop UPK because of all of these challenges? Do we have any data on that at all?
I think that's a good question for DCF potentially. I think one of the things that's challenging is the changes for a child care financial assistance program only went into effect in October of 2024. Yeah, right?
2025 was the first full year, yeah.
Yeah, 2025 is the first. So we don't,
People are still figuring it out.
People are figuring it out, right? Like it is a significant change in what providers are reimbursed.
Right.
And so the relative value, if you will, of universal pre-K has changed since CCFAP. So there may be, over time, you may see a change as a result of like sort of these challenges. And from the financial perspective, is it worth it anymore?
Doug?
Is my understanding correct with respect to the hiring of a teacher with the early childhood education or special ed endorsement? Is one needs to be hired. You have 3 preschool classrooms, 1 teacher suffices, correct?
That's correct. And I think that's one of the differences between universal pre-K and a public school versus at a private provider, that the public schools have to have a licensed teacher in every classroom, whereas the private provider has to have a licensed childcare teacher on staff, to your point, for multiple classrooms. And I think if it's a family care home, they just have to have a relationship, a contractual relationship with a licensed teacher.
But with the current difficulties of hiring that, even in a center that may have multiple classrooms, one teacher, any changes in requirements for teachers, if they match public school, would be increasingly difficult for private providers.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that's, I know has been talked about a lot is also in terms of the hiring space is what, in the Act 76 debate and conversations is that childcare providers often can't provide associated benefits. So if you're trying to find a licensed teacher who's looking at going into the public school where they'll receive healthcare and a pension and all of those sorts of things versus a childcare center where those things may not be available, there is, market tension there associated with just the realities of the current system.
And there's a revenue differential.
Yes. Okay, so now we'll talk about some of the options that are in the JFO report and then questions, I think. So more disclaimers, right? So one of the things for you all to think about as you're considering, Act 73 asked to re-examine the pre-K weight and sort of what should be done with this cohort as part of education transformation. It was just thinking about what the goals are of the early care and learning system in Vermont and what does the General Assembly want to prioritize going forward. Is it, in this space, it's thinking about workforce development and support. I can't remember where we were when we brought this bullet up, but somebody asked the question, right? Are you talking about workforce development for parents? Or are you talking about workforce development for the teachers in the space and the childcare workforce, right? Both are fair and important questions in early care and learning. Where does kindergarten readiness fall into the goals of early care and learning systems? Increasing participation in the public school system. Changing expenses in the education fund. Or other things, what are we trying to achieve with changes to the universal pre-kindergarten system? And, we had to approach providing options without knowing what the goals are. So we have 3 options, but they are sort of JFO being like, you could do this, but we don't actually know what you're trying to achieve. So it may not actually align with what your ultimate policy goals are, but here's the thing you could do. So in terms of what options are, right, you could focus primarily on the weight and make limited changes to align universal pre-K with the foundation formula. You could continue to operate the system as it exists, sort of largely unaltered until education transformation really kicks in, and then figure out how pre-kindergarten education fits into the new state of public education in the future. Or you could go, completely 180 and take a more comprehensive approach, evaluate the programs and the funding streams more in depth, and think more about how comprehensive changes would work in this greater education transformation system or anywhere in between, right? Those are the sort of general options. So the things that JFO outlines specifically in our report, sort of some of the things that we flagged as things to consider. So one of the options is to adopt more of like a money follows the student type policy, similar to the tuition policy at independent schools, right? Right now there's just a flat tuition rate, but it could be that if a child has that the full education opportunity payment would follow the child to wherever they receive universal pre-K, and then you could make a determination on whether or not any additional weights associated with that child would travel with that child. You could prorate the UPK weights depending on what's being provided at a public school in terms of how long-term ADM is calculated. That would probably be pretty administratively complicated, but the weight could flux depending on what the individual public school district is provided, and then tie the amount of funding that flows to that school district accordingly. There's also the option to change how you count universal pre-K when calculating CC FAP reimbursement, right? And that would Right now, there's that, if you're on the cusp of that 10 hours and you opt not to enroll because it will change how much you receive from CCFAP, you can change how that calculation is done. And that's one of the things that, it's complicated thing in the system to the extent UPK is a dollar amount that's flowing, whereas the CCFAP calculation is based on hours. And how do you reconcile those two things where the calculations are really done? They're looking at two different things. Those are the three, I don't want to call them wild and crazy options that JFO put out, but those are the three things that we came up with, but they really it's everywhere in between are things that the General Assembly could consider. So, and just high level takeaways, and I'm happy to take questions, but just everything's interconnected in this space. And it may be hard to make changes in one aspect without impact, having a waterfall down the system. I think we talked only a little bit about Head Start, right? To the extent Head Start is a federal program that the state doesn't really control, but to the extent those programs are operating based on what exists for CCFAP and UPK, it's important to make sure when you consider policy changes that the impact of those Head Start programs are thought about and whether or not it's going to impact what the local match is for those programs. And similarly, changing the number of hours of universal pre-K. Right now, it's 10 for 35 hours a week. That could be a different number. It may impact the benefits in CCFAP, right? If universal pre-K goes to 15, then you change that certificate that people in CCFAP may qualify for. And sort of what's the interaction between those two things if there's no change to the way that those hours are counted when calculating CCFAP certificates. Just to call this out again, there's limited data in this space. I think there's a lot more work to do in terms of collecting information. So it's hard to do analysis in terms of what's the impact on the education fund if X, because we don't really know what individual school districts are spending on pre-K. We have some data, but we can't parse out how much of this is tuition and how much of it is not. And we don't know how many hours each one is providing. So it's hard to do that analysis. And I think it's important to pull out, just to go back to that very first slide we show, I think the universal pre-K program and childcare financial assistance in terms of what's going on around the country. There's a lot of kids have access to universal pre-K in Vermont, and parents have increased access to subsidies to help make childcare affordable. And that's just an important thing to keep in context, we think, when thinking about what the next policy steps are in the early care and learning space. That's all we have. If you have any questions, it's a lot of information, and we were in Ways and Means like 4 times, I think, talking about this stuff. So happy to
And we have some members here.
hopefully they're not more confused, but I'm concerned. But yeah, if you have questions now, we're happy to answer questions now or come back, whatever works.
One of the outcomes of this study that I had hoped for, and maybe you have the information, I remain sort of a fan of sort of bifurcating what is public school and what is, call it childcare, whatever you want. And with this, new income stream of the childcare, the CCFAP payroll tax, that I sort of was hoping that this is an opportunity to say, okay, now we can just sort of say what goes on in a public school is public school, and what goes on in a private center is childcare. And is there enough revenue from the payroll tax if we were to make that sort of change to cover the cost? So in other words, if we said public schools are going to offer four-year-olds go to public school, everything else is childcare, that would remove pre-K, UPK dollars from the private sector, which I think when you talk about all the interrelated impacts of things, that's probably a huge one. But is there possibility of that sort of being made up for through the revenue of the childcare tax? I don't know, maybe your analysis didn't go in that far.
We didn't.
We didn't go in that far. I think it didn't go in that far because it's complicated and it depends on which policy lever you want to pull, right? Is it 3-year-olds are over here and 4-year-olds are over there? Okay, well, that's one analysis. If 4-year-olds are in the public system, is there capacity within the existing public system for their all to actually go to the public system? And if there isn't, would you still maintain parental choice? Like, would parental choice be maintained? Would there be and how would that play into that system? There was another one that I was thinking of.
Well,
Oh, and the number of hours, right? Like not knowing what the change, right now, it's the 10 hours per week and what the actual impact on the education fund would be if that was changed. If you pull the 3-year-olds out, but you put the 4-year-olds in, like, how does that interact with each other? So those sort of answering that question, we'd
Right.
have to make a lot of policy assumptions to answer that. So,
Absolutely.
um,
Can you talk although about the, given the program that we have and the CC levels of subsidy that we have, does the child care fund take in enough revenue to cover what we're already promising?
No, it's 6.5 million in the hole this year.
yeah, the governor's
That's an answer that helps. Thank you.
Yeah. The FY 27 budget has an additional $6.5 million of general fund going to CDD to cover anticipated childcare financial assistance
And
program.
is that considered, that's going to be like the case moving forward?
Hard to know.
Yeah.
Hard to know.
Without adjusting the rate? or anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think from the information we've seen from DCF, we've seen a very significant jump in the number of households, number of families accessing CCFAP. I mean, it's like, had a large increase. And so that obviously is impacted, and it's an entitlement now, which it wasn't when the bill was originally passed, which made a big difference. And I think, I'm kind of thinking back to the slide where you showed the differential in the age groups and the type of family childcare home and the age groups along the way. And, the place where there was sufficient revenue to keep the businesses going was in that preschool age. And we already know that preschool age group offsets some of the losses in the infant and toddler side of things. So it is like, pushing one button and you have different interactions all the way around for sure. And so we'll have to think really carefully about what buttons that we push and what ones we don't, and how we can take a look at this. But I think this has been really helpful. Thank you for all the work that you did on this over the summer. I know that, you probably both have a few more gray hairs than you started with. And that there's still a lot more to understand. And I think that one of the things that you laid out at the very beginning and then at the very end, again, is what are the objectives we're trying to achieve? And in Act 76, six.
It's not.
Yeah, six, sorry, I got confused for a moment. In Act 76, one of the things that we laid out as a policy goal is to really have universal access for all 4-year-olds in the system. That doesn't exist now. And, that's policy that the General Assembly adopted that we haven't achieved yet. And so, that's, when we talk about process, that's probably where our committee is going to start. So so people know kind of like, where does this go next? We are taking up and working with Ways and Means and Education to try to craft something. I'm not sure exactly what it's going to be yet. But we'll be taking a bunch of testimony this week, and then when we get back, this is one of those things where I have to get done before crossover. Thank you very much.
And fair to say that one of the challenging questions is we have a wait right now for pre-K. It's somewhat arbitrary. And so as we move forward with determining weights and moving towards an education opportunity payment, just what that weight should be if you are a public school offering full day, full week, universal pre-K. And then how do you ratchet it? I mean, you just then ratchet it down over
Brenda?
what that amount is.
Well, I know in Milton, they don't even have room for PreK. They do a lottery. So what happens if you increase it more? Like, where do kids go?
Well, I think that's one of the things that was outlined, space considerations are part of the issue, obviously, right? So, okay. Folks, ready?
Any
All
other
right.
questions over here?
A clarifying question on the money follows the student. In a sense, it follows them already to the tune of $3,800 some dollars. Is that referencing the full 6915 would follow the student?
Yeah, that was sort of the thought, right? That like the full amount that the school, that like if the school district counts the kid, the school district sends, the kid then attends somewhere else. Does all of that money then go with that child to their private provider?
And, you know, we have to think about qualifications, you know, so we don't have the same qualifications. And should we have the same qualifications? I think some would argue yes, you know, but I'd probably be one of them. Yes. All right,